completing a PhD in UK Sustainable Food Systems, plant-based health professionals member Jenny Griffiths has an avid interest in supporting a diet that focuses on holistic well-being for people and planet. Jenny holds diplomas in naturopathic nutrition and vegan and vegetarian nutrition consultation, as well as an MSc in environmental forestry and a BSc in applied ecology and conservation. So thank you for coming on the podcast, Jenny.
Thank you for having me.
So, a PhD in sustainable food systems sounds absolutely fantastic, but can you tell our audience how on earth did you end up with a specific focus on an area that is seaweed?
So the UK's Sustainable Food Systems PhD scheme, it's run through UKRI, and it was a really good opportunity to really tackle some quite hardcore environmental issues relating to diet, health, our wider systems. It seemed like an ideal opportunity, and seaweed is something that not a lot of people in the UK think about. And I first came across it from a nutrition point of view, really when I was investigating sources of iron. So myself, trying to be vegan at the time for various reasons, I just kept getting tired and run down, and eventually the diagnosis was, well, your iron's just too low, you're not eating enough iron. So I was like, well, how can I do this? How can I make this work? So I just did a bit of research and stumbled across some mentions of seaweed on the internet. And then when I started to dive a bit deeper into all of the other things that seaweed might have to offer, where else it is eaten, how it is wrapped up in different societies, how it grows, where we can find it, the fact you can just forage it yourself, it really opened my eyes to something that had quite a lot of potential, and yet it's something that we're doing nothing about in the UK. We're an island surrounded by water with this substance that grows prolifically, and it's eaten continually in Asian diets, yet we make very little of it here. So I thought I'd spend a PhD working out if seaweed was a good idea for us to be eating here. If not, why not? And if it is, how can that work, really? It's an exploration into what's right for us in the UK and what can seaweed offer us.
Right. And I think because we're going to be going straight into this topic that is seaweed, right at the beginning, we wanted to clarify, is there actually a better scientific name for it? Should we be calling it something else?
Seaweed is a bit of a derogatory term for a lot of people. It's actually an algae, which most people are familiar with as a sort of pond slime. Grows in water, doesn't look very nice. Although you'll also note that we are eating a lot more algae. You'll see microalgae supplements in health food stores, so it's becoming a bit more acceptable. Seaweed is actually a macroalgae, so rather than being a lot of single cells, it's actually a conglomerate of. So it grows in the seawater. It's a little bit different to what you would normally think of as a plant. And in fact, there's dubious classification as to whether or not you could even consider it a plant at all. It photosynthesizes, but it doesn't have any roots. So all that you see at the bottom there is a holdfast keeping it attached to the rocks. So it gets all of its nutrients by absorbing whatever is in the water column, aside from what it photosynthesizes with. It's ancient. It evolved about 1 billion years ago. So that's 480 million years before any land plants appeared. So it's had a tremendous amount of time to evolve a whole range of different compounds, fibers, chemicals, defense mechanisms, because it lives in a very hostile environment. And all of that come together means it's a mishmash of all these other things that you just wouldn't normally find in your diet. And it just seems like something a bit like mushrooms. You could really, a lot of dietary application there.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mention mushrooms there, because that was going to be something that we ask you about the kind of thinking about what types of seaweed you can actually eat and whether they're safe, because we know that when people go foraging for mushrooms, they need to know a lot about it, or they, risk some quite serious health problems. So can you talk us through what the different types of seaweed are, and maybe talk to us a little bit about which ones you can eat and whether some of them are actually off limits?
So seaweeds as a general term is about as vague as saying, mushrooms or pulses. They're all really different. It's a huge catch-all term. The main distinctions, these aren't the biological distinctions, but the main distinctions are a group of reds, a group of browns, and a group of greens. And they've all got slightly different characteristics. The reds are the oldest and they tend to be highest in protein, and the browns are very, very fibrous. And then you've got the greens, which have a bit more of a grassy taste and a sort of wider nutritional profile. And personally, I find them a little bit more palatable. The browns are quite intense. It's very difficult to eat very many browns at a time, very much of that. But then again, they've got a lot of application because they contain a very unique kind of fibre. The different colours come from the different pigments which are in them. So as with if you wanted a colourful fruit basket or vegetable plate, you could look at incorporating different colours of seaweed to get different nutritional benefit from them. Are they all edible? The question is probably more, would you want to? Some of them are very high in fibre, so although it wouldn't kill you, you probably really struggle to actually digest them. Some of them I think can be quite high in sulphur, so you would want to be cautious there. But ultimately, I'm not aware that there are any inherently seaweeds that ought to be off limit. It's more to do with the quality of the water that they're in. So you would need to be more careful if you are foraging them yourself, making sure you're getting them from cleaner waters. Anything that is for sale in the UK is going to be safe for you to consume. In the recommended portion sizes, always start small. So if it doesn't really agree with you, don't go all in for a big bowl of kelp noodles. Just try a little bit at a time.
And so you mentioned that obviously in a lot of other countries and cultures they do eat seaweed and they eat it in much larger quantities than we would do in the UK. But presumably they're not eating British seaweed. So can you tell us more about why you're championing the consumption of British seaweed in particular?
We're at a bit of a crux in our food systems at the moment where we've realised that we've got this, often termed the triple burden. We're overfed, undernourished from the micronutrients, and we are pretty much, our food systems are struggling essentially. I think really the answer is probably going to lie in the mosaic of where we get our food from. And at the moment, we're relying on a lot of imports. It's a lot of animal-based proteins. It's a lot of, and the main focus for a plants which are generally eaten are corn, wheat, soy. So moving more broadly and looking at more holistically how we're getting our food seems like a really sensible idea. Up until now, there's a huge terrestrial overfocus. So we're looking at how we can maximise our farming landscapes. But we forget the fact that we in the UK are actually an island. We've got a very large coastline. So could we be doing more with that? And seaweed doesn't require any fertiliser. It has a load of byproducts that we could use in a bioeconomy, circular economy sense. And we can also enhance our own health as well as, if we farm it properly, perhaps actually helping to repair some of the ecosystem damage which has been done in the oceans.
You mentioned that some of the limitations in how much you want to eat might be about the fibre content of some of these seaweeds, and that would be why people couldn't dive in and suddenly start eating huge quantities. So how much would you like perhaps to see people eating, and if so, in what form would that take?
So the key really is to have a little and often. If you look at how it's traditionally eaten in Asian diets, for example, it's a sprinkle in miso soup, it's an inclusion in some stew, it's a little bit into a salad. So you don't need to go big. I mean, you can go and buy kelp noodles, is I believe on the market in the US, and some people absolutely love it. But you don't need to consume it in vast quantities to get a little bit of an extra boost, which is how I think it really fits in best. It's also been incorporated into a few other things. So there's an absolutely amazing seaweed ketchup, which people rave about from the Pembrokeshire Beach Food Company. So you can do it that way. Unless you're living by the coast, it's quite difficult for you to be able to get fresh seaweed in the UK. You can do that if you want to go out and wild forage by yourself. You can, if as long as you're sensible with tide times, take all the look up sustainable foraging techniques first, make sure the water column is clean, and make sure that you know what you're taking and how much you're taking. For personal consumption, you don't need a license. But for most people, you'll be buying seaweed either in can form as lava bread, which is kind of like a puree, so you can spread that on toast or stir it into soup stews as you like. But dried is the most common form to find it. Generally, you'd add it to liquid. You can rehydrate it first and then add it to meals, or you can just sprinkle it in if it's a soup or something. And you're looking at 5 grams. So that would be a rough 5 gram portion of dried seaweed. So it's not vast quantities, but that has quite a good nutritional bang for its buck.
So what you're saying then is realistically you're just trying to get about probably 5 grams, about a tablespoon of dried seaweed.
Yeah, see it as like what you do with your pepper. Like your salt and pepper really adds something to your dish, or your nutritional yeast. How much nutritional yeast do you actually need in your day? But you might feel really amazing for having it.
Mm, well, you don't need it, but I like to add it to everything. The nooch.
Or if it's Marmite, some people love it, some people hate it, but you don't want a lot of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what you're doing is you're literally whetting our appetite here for adding this to our diet. And you've alluded to that there are a number of health benefits. And, we're getting into the environmental side as well and what eating seaweed could do for the environment. I think we should dig a bit more into maybe the health benefits first.
I was going to say it sounds quite manageable, doesn't it, to sprinkle a little bit of seaweed, but what health benefits is that going to give us, Jenny? Perhaps if we can just start with, rather than micronutrients, the macronutrients in seaweed. So is it a good source of protein or carbs? What are the sort of macros there?
So it's probably best thought of as edging towards a wider nutrient intake rather than focusing on the macros. It's very low in calories. It's usually less than 20 calories per portion. So it won't add very much in terms of carbohydrate, fat, or protein to your diet. That being said, the fats that it does contain are of the healthy polyunsaturated form, so the omegas that you'd want to be getting in your diet, and it's relatively high in protein, particularly the reds. So looking at sort of Welsh lava, that can be around 45% protein. Bearing in mind you're only having a small portion, though, it's not really going to add a huge amount of protein to your diet. So that the high fiber content will limit the amount that you can actually consume in one sitting for that, unless you were extracting things out, which I'm not really a fan of. We can talk about later.
That's really interesting. And what about from a micronutrient point of view? I was reading somewhere that it's a good source of B12. Could regular consumption of seaweed be a potential way of obtaining adequate B12 on a vegan diet?
Yeah, that I found really interesting, and it seems that there's some sort of bacterial interaction, which means that some seaweeds, but not all, some seaweeds are a good source of B12. So a 5 gram serving of sea moss, for example, wouldn't really give you so much in terms of B12, but 5 grams of lava will give you 65% of your daily recommended intake. So you can see that it's actually really worth eating the spectrum there. But if you are specifically looking for B12, you're probably best off with the reds. So that's lava or nori, which most people know it as, or dulse. And they also have a generally good content of B vitamins, as well as a bit of iron, magnesium in there. So you would be getting quite a rounded picture.
Nori is the one that's used in sushi, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, it's usually roasted and pressed into sheets,
Yeah.
and then it's used to wrap the rice. Or traditionally in Japan, they would sometimes just have the sheets and a bowl of rice, and then you can use it to sort of wrap it up.
That's really interesting. That's a good source of B12. I never knew that. That's wonderful. Any other micronutrients you wanted to focus on or tell us about?
Looking more generally, you can actually get as much B1 as in a serving of carrots in certain seaweeds. You can get, in fact, if you were eating a portion of dulse, you'll be getting more B6 than a serving of turkey, for example. People often think that it might be quite high in sodium, but it can often be less than a serving of cheese. And when you balance that against the amount of potassium in it, there's more potassium than in a tomato. So it's got quite a balanced electrolyte profile there as well. And your iron as well, you're often better off actually eating a bit of seaweed, or if you eat knotted racks, one that does grow in the UK, you can actually get more iron in that than a serving of sardines.
Wonderful. That's good to know. And what about the effects on the gut microbiome? Because you mentioned the fibre and it might be difficult for some people to digest. In what way is seaweed a prebiotic?
So the fibres in seaweeds are actually really different to those found in land plants. I mentioned that they evolved many millions of years ago, which means that they have cell walls that contain quite different fibres. And each of the different colours has a slightly different polysaccharide that makes that up. So you've got fucoidin, laminarin, alginate, olivin. So they're all unique to seaweed. You won't get those anywhere else. And there's quite a lot of research to suggest that those are really good at enhancing quite a positive gut flora, which can have really important knock-on effects for your immune system function, lowered blood pressure, better blood sugar control, all the sort of metabolic syndrome factors. But there may well be other things in there as well. So rather than sort of taking a fucoidan or alginate extract specifically for gut health, I would suggest you're probably better off eating the whole thing, because we don't know how that's working in context. There's also some really interesting research, which is a bit of a side point, but it seems that East Asians, where they've continued to eat seaweed in sort of Korea and Japan, can actually digest them really differently to the way that Europeans can, because there's been some lateral gene transfer over the years that they've eaten them, so that the bacteria in the gut are now actually able to make use of the seaweed that they are eating. Yeah, that was just an interesting side point, I thought.
Yeah, so maybe we should be starting early.
Well, there's actually a surprising amount of research to suggest that seaweeds have been more a part of human evolution than we really realise. Because the classic idea is that human brains developed because humans learnt to catch animals and eat meat, and they could suddenly get all of these proteins and nutrients from there. But the reality is we were probably hunter-gatherers. We were probably moving around our coastlines and our waters. And actually the compounds that are found in seaweeds are really important for brain health and brain development. So there's now something called the kelp highways hypothesis, where previously we thought people moved into the North Americas and then kind of followed the animals inland and sort of crossed there. But it's more likely that they followed the coastline down and actually had seafoods and things like that, and then were able to sometimes get a bit of meat or whatever. But it's been less spoken about until now, because seaweed is a biodegradable compound, so you wouldn't find that in the fossil record in the same way as you might find animal bones and tools.
That's fascinating. And that takes me straight on very nicely to what I was going to ask you about brain health. In fact, having heard that fish obtain these essential fatty acids, EPA and DHA from algae, is the direct consumption of algae, seaweed, a good idea, a good way of obtaining those fatty acids? And could we be saving money on supplements, algae-based omega supplements?
So the fats in seaweed are of the healthy sort of EPA, DHA type, but remember I said it's quite actually a low fat food. And bear in mind that fish eat not just seaweed, macroalgae, but they eat microalgae, and they eat vast quantities of it, and then they eat each other. So the process of bioaccumulation means that is why fish is usually recommended as a good source of these fatty acids. So seaweed might add a little bit to your diet, but don't just eat it for the fatty acids, I'm afraid. There have been attempts to extract the oils from it, but again, you're losing all of the fiber benefits and things then as well.
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of algae-based supplements on the market now, aren't there? We've got a whole episode on this if anybody wants to delve back into the world of EPA and DHA.
And those will be based on microalgae rather than the macroalgae. So that will be sort of photobioreactors that are sort of fermented up, and they'll be deliberately expressing a lot of these compounds so that you can then pop that into a capsule.
Right, okay. So the microalgae that they use to make the capsules are not the ones that are eaten at all in sort of macroalgae type form. They're two very distinct types of seaweed. Sorry, this is a really silly question.
So microalgae isn't really seen as seaweed. So they're slightly different. They can be grown in photobioreactors or raceway ponds. I believe that they will grow in fresh water, and they're aquatic. But macroalgae is the seaweeds, which is what you would see in the sea, really. And they have quite a different life cycle as well. Rather than being single-celled, they're whole organisms in and of themselves. But being single cells, there's more you can do with microalgae, because if you can manipulate, there's interest in manipulating sort of genetic codes and kind of encouraging them to express certain things. They can be quite a sustainable way of growing things, because they take up very little space, need very little resource, grow very, very quickly, and might be a sort of way to kind of manufacture that type of thing if you haven't got the land space available or something like that. It's an ongoing area of research, but that would be things like spirulina, chlorella. You're in that ballpark.
Understood. Right. Thank you for clarifying, Jenny. That's taken me right back to my A-level biology days of single-cell organisms versus multi-cell flashbacks there. Right. Let's go back to the micronutrients and the benefits of seaweed. I've heard that some types are very high in iodine, and obviously that could make them a good source of this important micronutrient. But is there a risk of overconsumption of iodine, and what do we need to know here?
Yeah, I mean, I would always say if you're aware that you have a sensitivity to iodine or you have thyroid issues, then approach with caution. It is a good source of iodine, as with, in fact, most seafoods. It does have a high iodine content, which again is why it's important to eat it in its whole form in small quantities to begin with, because if you eat it in whole form, the fiber actually means you're probably not going to be eating vast quantities where you're going to cause yourself toxic overload, and it gives your body that chance to actually naturally keep itself in check and start small, because if it's something that doesn't agree with you, don't carry on. However, having said all that, iodine is actually really essential for thyroid function, and we don't synthesize it in the body, so we need to get it through our diets. And the UK, actually, along with a lot of other Western countries, Australia, New Zealand, we are known to be largely deficient here. So a lot of European countries actually iodize their salt, which we don't do here. There is criticism as well that there's mixed messages for doing that, because if you're simultaneously telling people not to salt their food and also saying, but we're going to put iodine in your salt because it's good for you, it's sort of muddying the nutritional waters, if you like, there. Where seaweed consumption is higher, there's actually health benefits beyond meeting your daily iodine intake. So Japanese women consume about 200 times the amount of iodine per day than US women. They also have reduced rates of breast cancer. So iodine is thought to maybe act as a bit of an antioxidant to help with the tumours. If you are concerned about iodine, though, it's actually very easy to remove it. There's very simple processing methods. So just by washing it, cooking it, drying it, you will drastically reduce the iodine content. So if you're looking at iodine figures for something that's just come out of the sea, that'd be really different to what you actually then get on your plate. Bearing in mind, you're also eating that alongside other foods, which will have an effect on what you're actually absorbing.
And am I right in thinking there are certain types that are higher in iodine anyway, and if you're concerned about that, you could avoid those types?
That would mostly be the browns, which are the majority. Well, no, they're probably not the majority in the UK. The ones you'll often see near shore in the UK on the beaches, but we do have more sort of further out. So yeah, the browns can be very high in iodine, but remember also those ones are also very high in fibre, so it'd be difficult to eat a lot of them. And if you wanted to have a slightly lower iodine version, I would go with the green seaweeds.
What an example of a green seaweed that we normally have in the UK?
So sea lettuce. Sea lettuce would be a good one.
Oh yeah, okay, I've seen that in the shops recently. I've been looking out for seaweed in the shops recently since we knew we were going to speak to you. Never seen sea lettuce before, but now it's popping up.
Well, no, that's one of the things that really blew my mind as well, because I started doing all this reading, going, seaweed's amazing, I need some of this in my life. And then I was going, why can't I find it on the shelves? Where is it? Who's selling it? There's this sudden wonder food that I want to know everything about, and nobody's selling it. What's going on?
Yeah, it's sort of like health food shops and things, isn't it?
If you're lucky enough to have an Asian shop nearby, they will be selling wakame. Wakame, actually, so the species is Undaria, and it's the one that you will find in sort of Chinese noodle soups and things. It's quite thick, it's quite long, so you'll get it in quite big packets, and it's got quite a seaweedy flavour and smell. You will know it's there. It actually can be really nutritious as well, so that's why they add it to the food. But it's an invasive species in the UK, so whilst we do have it in some areas here, we can't sell UK grown Undaria because you can't encourage an invasive species to be growing, which is a bit of a strange point, because if you wanted to eat wakame, that is always going to be imported. You can never grow that yourself here.
We're going to go on to environmental impacts in a minute, but before we do, can I ask you, are there any risks? I mean, I know you talked a little bit about iodine and people who are concerned about their intake or their thyroid. Are there any other sort of risks, or I'm thinking along the lines of, I don't know, heavy metals or other environmental pollutants?
Yeah, so there are concerns, and quite warranted concerns, that seaweed could contain heavy metals, because obviously it's in the water column, it's absorbing what's in there, and if you've got polluted water, then it will be lapping all of that up, and for the same reason, it can be really good for bioremediation, and quite good in polluted areas for cleaning them. Anything for sale in the UK is going to be fine, because the Food Standards Agency put strict limits, blanket limits on any kind of food which is sold here, so you're safe. If you're collecting your own, though, be much more cautious. And also, if you've got any doubts about the sourcing or the stringency of the supply chain in the seaweed that you're buying, approach with caution. As with iodine, though, a lot of it can be lost through just simple cooking methods, particularly if it's UK grown, you should be absolutely fine, because we make sure our waters are safe, really, for anything that is then sold on the market.
Brilliant. That's good to know. I don't think I'll be in the sea yet trying to harvest my own. So I think I'll be safe in the
It's
supermarket.
really easy. When you learn to recognise just a few simple ones that you know you can eat or you can't, so you've got like egg rack, bladder rack, sea lettuce, lava, you just go down there in your wellies with a bag and take a pair of scissors with you, and then they come at different points in the shoreline. So you just go down there with a pair of scissors, make sure you're not like yanking off whole hold fast. You just give it a snip, pop it in your bag, and then if you're near clean waters, then, I mean, you could just eat it straight away. I mean, I'd always suggest that you go home, wash it carefully. If you want to cook it, particularly if it's the brown ones, you'll find that. And you'll see in the water how things start to leach out a little bit. So, yeah, which obviously may have an impact on the nutrition, but mostly it's a positive impact. And then, yeah, you can eat it like that, chuck it in a salad. I try fermenting seaweed. I wouldn't recommend my method.
Claire's laughing because she knows I'll never be harvesting my own. I'll be in the health food shop somewhere looking at shelves and packets, probably, just for now.
You can also get it online. If you look at, say, the Cornish Seaweed Company, or Carrymore, who are my favourite, who means love of the sea, which are the Welsh-based ones. And because it's dried, it's really light, so you can order it in the post, and they can just pop it through your letterbox.
Okay, perhaps you can give us some links, and we'll pop those in the show notes. But I'll hand it back over to Claire now, because I know she's got lots of questions about environmental impacts.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort of sift through in my mind what I should ask you next, Jenny, because the questions in my mind now are whether we're talking about actual seaweed farms or whether we're just talking about harvesting what's already out there. So can you tell us, because we're, especially with the Eat Lancet report update having come out recently, and you've already mentioned about, sustainable foods and things, can we get into those questions now and maybe think about, what is a seaweed farm? What does that look like?
So the majority of the seaweed in the UK is still wild harvested, because we don't have the tradition of seaweed farming. And I'm definitely not a seaweed farmer. So what I know about what we do here is comes from reading, watching, and site visits. But if we want to feed more people with more seaweed, and we want to expand our food sources, we need to produce more of it, which is going to require farming. Where we are actually cultivating at the moment, it's mostly fairly small scale, and that'd be quite near shore. So you get long lines of ropes, or something similar, and they're strung out in a sort of grid shape and suspended with buoys. And then you seed the seaweed onto the ropes, and it grows downwards into the water column. That kind of seaweed farming is it's actually often combined with shellfish like oysters and mussel pots. Like putting marigolds in your allotment, there seems to be quite a really positive effect on both when they're combined. So that gives farmers a sort of more balance and can be quite good for long-term, a sort of healthier environment in general. So it's sort of like a difference between agroforestry techniques or gardening, cultivation versus just plain extraction.
Human beings don't have a very good track record on farming when it comes to environment and sustainability. That, for me, I do worry about people sort of, given that it is such a home to other creatures, how does it work? Even if somebody comes along and forages and just, snips some seaweed and steps on things, that's going to disrupt the environment on a small scale, isn't it? But when you get to a farming level, how do we really have consideration for those things?
Yeah, and I think that could be both a difficulty, but actually a real plus point for seaweed farming in the UK, because we haven't got that industry already set up, and we can learn from all of those mistakes that we've already made. So we know what we've done in terrestrial agriculture. We've seen that if you overfocus on one thing, it can have really, really negative impacts. So we've actually really got an opportunity now to start to build a system that actually operates on a more holistic framework and actually thinks about the sinks and flows of energy, how you can have byproducts from seaweed which can form inputs for something else, which can form an output that can go back in. So you can, by design, have a more circular economy approach, which is going to be actually much more wholesome, not just for people. We need to think bigger. So we've been quite self-focused in how we think we're very, very separate from the whole of the rest of the ecosystem functioning. And actually, we not only have an impact on it, but really rely on all of our environment to operate in cohesion with us and consider ourselves a part of that. And if we want to continue to really thrive in the way that we're accustomed to living, or even in a better way that we're accustomed to living, we need to consider that we are not isolated beings. So for me, it actually offers quite a lot of hope. If you're looking for sort of the large scale farming, then we need to really think about and plan really carefully how that's going to look in the UK. There are very large offshore outfits at the moment. The biggest one is in Indonesia, which is about 1 square kilometre. I don't have any details about the sustainability of that farming technique, but obviously, if you have got vast mechanical harvesting, then you are more likely to be causing damage. And making sure you're siting them in the right places is going to be important. And also establishing what that biophysical limit is. How big can we get before it starts to really have a negative impact? So if we can plan all that before we've hit those barriers where we realise it's all gone wrong, that's actually a really positive and privileged position to be in.
I think it's just that it has such a negative association in my mind, the idea of a fish farm, and it feels quite close to that, even though it's the seaweed, because of the codependency of other creatures on that.
So bear in mind, though, that seaweed does grow by itself in the water. You're not actually needing to manage it in any way.
Right.
So if you're looking at on land, you've got a monoculture, but you're also adding a huge amount of chemical input to that. With seaweed, it's actually providing a healthier water environment, whether or not that creature is in the seaweed, because of the filtration there, and because the smaller organisms there, because you've got the water column moves out, see, so it will be passing through the seaweed, so it's got a wider impact, if you like, and you're not actually adding any artificial fertilizers or anything to it. There has been anecdotal evidence that fish populations around seaweed farms are healthier and they start to recover.
Fantastic. Okay, so there is that spillover environmental benefit there then, for sure, that's already been identified. Now, coming back to, we've already talked about the fact that at the moment, there are huge cultural differences in who will eat seaweed and who won't. And so we were wondering, what steps do you think could be taken to help promote seaweed and perhaps people to work in this area, and then to actually get a market for it in the UK? What would you like to see happen now?
Most people in the UK have sort of seen it around the sushi wraps, let's say. So that now is becoming more familiar. People are a little accepting the fact that seaweed is edible a little bit more. But there is actually a much bigger heritage of seaweed in the UK than most people are aware of. The problem is it got a bit of a reputation as a poor man's food. So it was really harvested in times of famine and people were making the most of it. That being said, it's also quite there's a strong tradition, like heritage pride in something like Welsh lava bread. Or in Scotland, they've got sort of dulse oatmeal, or Ireland, they use the sort of thickened milk puddings. What we can do in the UK, though, in a more modern context, is to work out what do people want in their diets at the moment. And like I say, it's about adding it in small amounts. So you could use it as a salt, or start off with the condiment version if you like. As I mentioned, a seaweed ketchup. That'd be something you could buy off the shelf. You can get a lot more inventive with it in your own kitchen if you like. It's been used in salted caramel ice cream. But it's usually used to sort of evoke sort of fishy flavours. It's got that connotation of the seaside with it. So if you're looking at vegan meals that you could be doing, you could be grilling a tofu fillet and wrapping it around there as a sort of like a fish fillet. Or if you wanted to make a sort of version of a fish pie, mushrooms, pop it in the mashed potato, or you could put it into the white sauce that you're making. Honestly, I mean, I think just glorify it as it is. It's seaweed. Don't pretend you're not eating seaweed, and it can actually add a real depth to a dish. So you can use it as a salt replacer as well. If you're worried about having a high sodium chloride intake, just add seaweed instead of salt. That's one really easy way into seaweed, just to get little things. And I mean, I would love to see it on every table. Instead of having your salt and pepper, have your seaweed and pepper. Or seaweed, salt and pepper if you actually still want your salt on there. Because it will give you that sort of salty flavour, but it'll also give you a whole range of other micronutrients that you might otherwise be missing out on. There's some really fun chemical fun about how seaweed can really enhance the umami flavour there. So it actually gets its flavour from its high glutamic acid content. If you pair that with guanylate, which is found in mushrooms, particularly shiitake mushrooms, you get this synergistic effect in the dish, which actually creates a really massive umami hit. And actually, when you think about it, that's how it's traditionally used in Asian culture as well. You pop it in your miso soup in that way. But very, very quickly, you can have quite a rich and comforting flavour in a soup or a stew without that heavy, salty feeling afterwards. And there's another sort of flavour idea called kokumi, which is that kind of if you stew something for a very long period of time, it gets that really kind of like deep belly feel. That's supposed to be that kind of flavour.
Lovely. I love that idea of the condiment providing all these micronutrients and fibre and a bit of iron sprinkled on instead of salt. That's brilliant.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you're adding salt, that's only sodium chloride, and why don't you get it in a good balance?
I was just going to say that I completely buy that it's got the umami and the saltiness and the fishiness as well. But I have to come back to that comment about putting it in salted caramel ice cream, because it must have gone in a really homeopathic dose not to put people off.
I haven't got the recipe, but it has been used in quite a lot of it is in sort of haute cuisine type restaurants where they're trying to really do something slightly different. Adding salt to caramel is not something I would have thought of to begin with. And you see sea salted chocolate and all these things that you think won't work that actually really do.
It's like the addition of miso into desserts now, isn't it? You're seeing that crop up in fancy restaurants.
I think we can ask you now, having talked about all this seaweed, about what you're having for dinner and whether you're going to be incorporating it.
I'm a bit of a purist with seaweed, so I like a good noodle soup. So I will make a sort of miso-based broth with ginger and garlic and all of the good stuff, some greens, maybe some mushrooms or tofu or something like that. And then I either chuck in the seaweed with the greens or sprinkle it on the top. So and I like it with a good dose of rice noodles in there. So it's a sort of Vietnamese style abomination if any Vietnamese person ever saw it. But yeah. So that's how I like to use it. But there are also a lot of sort of more Western dishes you can use it in. So you can chuck it in with your macaroni cheese or whatever it is, stir it through, to give it that extra crunch, extra something.
Amazing. And what I'm going to ask now is, Daisy, whether have you been inspired to get that packet of kelp out of your cupboard and look up some recipes tonight?
It's not quite been kelp, but in anticipation of this episode, I did actually buy some seaweed from, well, it's just nori sheets. I guess that is dry seaweed, isn't it? I used to buy it from Clear Spring, and I'm going to try and recreate. I don't know if you've heard of Happy Mackie, Jenny. They seem to pop up at plant-based and vegan festivals and things. It's basically like a burrito, but they wrap the rice and the tofu and everything in the nori.
Oh, they're delicious. Yes.
So good. I'm going to try and recreate that. So it's not like sushi. It's not quite formal. You just will make whatever rice, tofu, veggies, and then just literally wrap it in this seaweed, this nori sheet.
That's a great way forward, because you can actually eat with you can have lots of little dishes on the table and invite friends. Then everybody just fills it with what they want. And it's basically like having like a fajita night, but you're doing it with the seaweed as your base.
Exactly. That's what I'm going to try and recreate tonight. But I was going to ask you, before I ask you, Claire, about what you're having, is that whole drying and roasting and sort of preserving the seaweed into that dry, does that actually have an impact on the micronutrients that are available? Am I better off having like a fresher source of it?
We did mention about the processing. Actually, it will have an impact. Some things will come off in the water, but then with anything that you're cooking, anything that you're eating, you will be changing the micronutrient profile. So see it in the same context, eat it in various different forms, be guided by what tastes good to you, because that, if you're actually really listening to what your body's saying, then that's what's right for you at the time. It's quite difficult to get fresh seaweed unless you're by the coast in this country, so you may just be limited to dried anyway. So try a few different seaweeds in a few different forms if you can. Plus, you have got tinned lava bread. You might find it is cooked, but it's a different form. And you've also possibly, if you're near an Asian supermarket, you might find it in the freezers, but that won't be UK grown.
Claire, are you foraging in the waters near where you are at the moment? Because you probably the closest.
It's funny you say that, because of course I am on the coast at the moment, but I think the closest I'm going to get to seaweed is maybe some of the brown stuff that you talked about getting wrapped around my leg, if I manage to make it into the water this weekend. But I'm going to the only vegan restaurant on the Isle of Wight tonight, and I've never seen seaweed on the menu. And I've had to pre-order my dinner, and it's cottage pie with lentils, so something very traditional for me. But I can see how you could really enhance that kind of lentil filling, couldn't you, with some umami sprinkling of exactly that kind of chopped up seaweed that you talked about.
Actually, because you're saying about seaweed wrapping around your leg, you can actually bathe in seaweed. So I put it in a little sock first, because otherwise you do get it like stroking you in the bath. But it soaks in the water, and then because our skin is obviously so exposed to everything and lots of pores, and it's the biggest organ in the body, you can absorb a lot of the nutrients through the water. So you can have a bath in seaweed.
Eating it and putting it in
That
the bath.
last bit is really fascinating, isn't it, Daisy? Just imagining it wrapping itself around you in the bath. That's a bit too much. And also, Jenny, I'll come back to another thing that you said earlier, when you said there's a lot of discussion about whether it's actually a plant, and I thought, oh my goodness, she's going to say it's an animal.
I've got loads of fun facts about seaweed, actually. So I'm just going to carry on.
I was going to say, give us a fun fact before we wrap up for today.
So in islands like Fiji and Polynesia, traditionally they don't grow any land plants at all. So seaweeds was the only like plant matter in their diet. So they would literally just be eating seaweed with some sort of sea food like mussels and stuff like that, and fermented coconut, and that would be their meal. Seaweed has also been used to help with childbirth because of its sort of slipperiness. And from a dietary point of view, it's actually still really traditional for recently birthed mothers to be given seaweed soups, because it's really nourishing and it helps to restore iron levels and all of those sort of build you up type drinks. So in the UK, it's like, oh, I have a Guinness, but in Korea, it's still about a seaweed soup. And there's a lot of connection between seaweed and women, which I don't really know why, and I don't quite understand why, but it's often just quite a big connection with women and the sea, and particularly in Hawaii, where women traditionally were not allowed to eat animal foods, so they supplemented their diet with what they could forage around the sea. They could eat shellfish and things, and actually seaweed, and they think that it was a really important part of actually making sure that they did meet their nutritional need. And likewise, when you've got traditional Buddhist monks who eat an entirely vegan diet and are mostly rice-based and might be living in the mountains and could otherwise be deficient in iodine and iron and various other things, they think that actually including seaweed in with the rice enabled them to keep, mentally sharp and well. So yeah, the iodine is actually can be really important, because we used to have iodine in our soils, most of which is diminished now because we overwork them. And so our vegetables aren't as high in iodine as they used to be. If you're living near the coast, they're more likely to have iodine in them, because when the seawater evaporates into the clouds, and then the first rain that you're going to get is by the coast. By the time it's moved in, and so it will deposit the iodine into the soils and onto the crops there. The further inland you get, so if you're living in a mountainous area, sort of in the middle of the Alps or something like that, you've actually not got a lot of iodine in your soil.
That's great. I can certainly get on board with this. I'm going to go and find some new ways of eating seaweed. That's been really inspiring, Jenny. Thank you so much for chatting with us today. If people are interested and want to know more, how can they connect with you? Are you on any social media platforms?
So I am a member of the Plant-Based Health Professionals, so you can look me up on there. For the next couple of years, I'll be carrying on with my PhD, so you can reach me there by email. So that'll be j.griffiths@greenwich.ac.uk. But yeah, find me on the website.
Brilliant. And thank you once again.
I've loved our chat today. It's been brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.